Hello and welcome to this section. In this section, I'll be explaining about PostgreSQL triggers, why you should use the triggers, and also when to use the triggers. So what is a trigger? A PostgreSQL trigger is a function invoked automatically when an event associated with a table occurs. So it is a function that automatically triggers or fires off when an event associated with a table occurs. So there are different kinds of events that can happen on a table. An event could be anything, like an insert, when you insert something in a table, when you update a record in a table, when you delete a record, or when you truncate a table. So these are various types of events that can occur on a table. A trigger is a special user-defined function that binds to a table. So a trigger is a special user-defined function. So it's a function that the user defines and it binds to a table. So you have to associate a trigger with a table. And when you create a trigger, you can indicate when the trigger should fire off. So it can either fire off before or after an event occurs. So you can specify when to invoke the trigger. Before you can create a new trigger, you must first of all define a trigger function first. Once you've defined the trigger function, you then bind the trigger function to a table. The key difference between a trigger and a normal user-defined function is that a trigger is automatically invoked when an event occurs. There are two main types of triggers. There is a row trigger and there is a statement level trigger. So these are the two main triggers. Triggers that happens on the row level or triggers that happens at the statement level. The differences between the two types of triggers basically is how many times the trigger is invoked and at what time. For example, if you issue an update statement that affects 20 rows, the row level trigger will be invoked 20 times, while the statement level trigger will be invoked just the one time. And when you define a trigger, you can specify whether the trigger should be invoked before or after an event. If the trigger is invoked before an event, it can skip the operation for the current row or even change the row that is being updated or inserted. In case the trigger is invoked after the event, all the changes are available to the trigger. There are benefits of using triggers. When you use triggers, they can be useful in increasing the security of various databases. So is used to maintain the integrity. So if you have certain rules on your database, you can use triggers to maintain the integrity of the data in that data. You can also use triggers to check the activities of various types of application accessing your databases. So if you want to know what's going on, or if you want to know if any unusual activity is going on within an application that accesses the database, you can use triggers to achieve that. So triggers are useful in case the database is accessed by various applications and you want to keep the cross functionality within database that runs automatically when the data of the table is modified. For example, if you want to keep history of data without requiring application to have the logic to check for every event, such as an insert or update, you can use triggers to achieve that. And triggers also helps you maintain complex data integrity rules, which you cannot implement elsewhere except at the database level. For example, when a new row is added into, for example, a customer table, other rows must also be created in tables of banks and credit. Say, for example, if you have different table, one is called customer, one is called banks, one is called credit, you can set up a trigger so that when a new row is added to one table, it also inserts something in the other table. So there are different things you can do with triggers. There are also drawbacks of using triggers. And one of the main drawbacks of using triggers is that you must remember when you have a trigger on your database, and you must also understand the logic so you can figure it out if there's any data changes or if there's any issues. So even though the PostgreSQL implements the international SQL standard triggers, in Postgres it has some of its own specific features. For example, with the PostgreSQL, when the trigger goes off each time a truncate event happens. Truncate basically is when a table is stripped of its data. So anytime a truncate event happens, it automatically fires off a trigger in PostgreSQL. Also in PostgreSQL, it allows you to define statement level trigger on views. So if you have views set up, you can also define statement level triggers on the views. Also, it requires you to define a user defined function as the action of the trigger, while the SQL standard allows you to use any number of SQL commands. So this is key difference. With PostgreSQL, it requires you to define a user defined function as the action of the trigger, in comparison to the standard SQL, where you can use any number of SQL commands to do that. So those are the two key the differences between using the standard SQL and the PostgreSQL trigger. So that's it for this introduction to Postgres trigger. In the next lecture, we are going to learn how to create our first trigger. Thanks for watching.